Morning and good afternoon. My name is Kate Rademacher, and I'm currently working as an independent consultant doing some work with the Reproductive Health Supplies Coalition, which is one of the partners sponsoring this event. We're really delighted to see everyone joining. Just to go over a few logistics before we start, the event is being recorded and we have live translation in both French and Spanish. So if you need interpretation, please click on that in your Zoom bar. Also, there's a Q&A function in Zoom, so we invite you to submit your questions at any time. We have everyone muted, but again, please be noting down your Q&A. We have several speakers, so we're going to go through those and then open up to several moments of questions and answers. So look forward to hearing your comments and questions. Just by way of introduction, this session is part of the Innovation in Contraceptive Development and Introduction series that is being sponsored by the CTI Exchange and several other partners. The first session in this series was hosted earlier this year in May, which focused on method mix, and you can catch the recording of that if you weren't able to join. And today we're going to be looking at funding. And this is an area that's really important since contraceptive R&D funding has sometimes been neglected. And we're going to be looking at trends in contraceptive R&D funding, as well as progress at incorporating human-centered design and investments, as well as just an overview of strategic investments, what's happening, some cutting-edge work, and what's really needed to move the field forward. So I'm really excited for this discussion and want to thank our speakers who have joined today. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, who's Cecile Ventola. Let me just pull up her bio. Cecile has a PhD in public health and is specialized with a specialty in sexual and reproductive health. She's worked for several French national institutes, the World Health Organization, and a menstrual health startup before joining PolicyCure's research as a senior technical officer for SRH starting in May. She's conducted research on contraception, abortion, gender-affirming healthcare, sexual health, gender, and we're really delighted to have her here to share some of the results from the most recent PolicyCure study. So over to you, Cecile.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Kate, and thanks for having me. So yeah, I will be taking you briefly through the data that we have through PolicyCure's research G-Finder survey on global funding for contraception. And I'm just going to start with a few words on the survey itself. If you can go to the next slide, just so that you can understand where the data comes from and contextualize it. So the G-Finder survey tracks annual investment in several areas of global health. It has been going on since 2007, and it is an annual survey with funders, with grant recipients, with the industry, and we're also using publicly available data, for example, from the US NIH or the Gates Foundation. And just to make a little comment, taking into consideration the next presentation by Stasia, when we talk about industry funding, we're mostly capturing self-funded research and development projects, and not as of today, VC funding. So just so you know that the data I'm going to be presenting, it does not include that aspect of funding. But yeah, to go back to the G-Finder survey, it focuses on three main areas of global health: neglected diseases, emerging infectious diseases, and sexual and reproductive health. And it is LMIC's focus. So both in our scope for the type of diseases that we look at and also the type of products that we integrate, they have to be LMIC applicable. When it comes to sexual and reproductive health, the data was first collected in 2013 and it's become part of the annual survey since 2018. So the data that I'm going to be presenting is for 4 years from 2018 to 2021. And I also wanted to say a few words about contraception and how we approached it in the survey. So our scope is all contraceptive research from early stage to post-registration studies. It includes drugs, vaccines, biologics, devices, and combinations. And again, we have this LMIC lens where the products must be LMIC applicable to be included. In the survey and in this presentation, we're using different categories to distinguish between different contraceptive products, methods, that are based on the duration of the different products. So there's the very classic category of LARCs, long-acting reversible contraception, for example, intrauterine systems or yearly intravaginal rings. There's short-acting contraceptives, for example, the monthly oral contraceptive pill or microarray patches or the testosterone gel. There's on-demand contraception that has to be used around the time of the intercourse. in the forms of capsules, oral pills, gels. There's permanent contraception. And then we have a category that we call multiple or unspecified duration. And that is for grants, for example, that cover multi-year, multi-method project, for example, funding clinical trial for multiple methods, so that the grant is not specific enough to be allocated to one type of duration, one type of category, or it's for research that is in such early stage that the duration of the product is not determined yet. So all of this funding are captured under that category. And one last specification before we can dive in, we do include multi-purpose technologies, contraceptive MPTs, but we analyze them separately, and that's because both their R&D path can be quite specific, their research agenda can be quite specific. So we do look at them, but in a separate way from the general contraceptive data, just to have in mind during the presentation. Yeah, now that it's all established, we can actually dive in and move on to the next slide. So this next slide is an overview of the global investment in contraceptive R&D for the 4 years that I mentioned. In dark green, you have sort of traditional contraceptive R&D, and in light green, CMPTs. What we can see here is just the general level of investment, but also the fact that investment has been generally stagnant over the past 4 years and with a recent decline. When including CMPT's funding data, we can see that the structure of the investment doesn't really change, but it does act as a sort of a buffer where the differences between the years are not as drastic. But yeah, that gives you an overview of the general landscape and the amount. And we can go a bit deeper for 2021 in the next slide. So this is a snapshot for 2021. On the left, you have the different categories of contraceptive that I just introduced in the introduction. So by duration, the level of funding, and then for each category, we broke it between the type of products, so devices and combination, drugs, biologics, etc. So what does the data tell us here? The most funded category in 2021 was LARCs, long-acting reversible contraception, with $53 million and representing 45% of the global amount. As you can see with the size of the dark green box here, it's almost exclusively invested in device and combination products, which kind of makes sense with LARCs as we know them. And in terms of trends, 2021 was the third consecutive year with a decrease overall of the amount invested in that category, but it is still dominating the field, as you can see. The second category is multiple or unspecified duration. So like I explained, it's for grants where it's not specific enough for us to allocate them to a duration. In this category, it's focused on both drugs in light green and on unspecified product, which makes sense with the category. This amount has been doubling since 2018. The focus on products has remained generally the same across years with some fluctuation. Then we can move on to the third category, which is short-acting contraception, with 23 million, representing 20% of the global amount. This is mainly concentrated on drug R&D, as you can see with the light green, with some investment as well in device and combinations, for example, intravaginal rings or microarray patches. And for 2021, it was half of what it was in 2020, but the drug focus remains the same across all years that we study here. Next category is on-demand contraception, with just above 4 million invested, just under 4% of the general amount. It's mostly going to novel drugs, and both the funding levels and the focus on drugs as quite consistent across years. The least funded category is permanent contraception, with just 1 million and 1% of the global amount. And actually for 2021, it comes down to one single grant that was going towards a female sterilization method. It's less than half as much as either 2020 or 2018, but actually in 2019, there was zero investment in this category. So you can see that it's not the most favorite for investors here. There's additional information on this graph that I should comment on, like in purple, where you can see with the arrows, it is to give you an example of what happens if we were to add contraceptive MPTs to the analysis, and it would change the amounts quite drastically for some of the categories. So for example, for short-acting methods, if we were to add CMPTs, it would add 12 millions to this category. For example, for intravaginal rings that protect both against pregnancy and HIV. And if we were to add CMPTs to end demand, it would really make the category much bigger with 32 additional millions, with, for example, vaginal gels, films, or fast dissolve inserts. And that sort of reflects a trend of the CMPT field, where a lot of the research and development is more user-centric than usual, and actually trying to respond to growing demands from user preferences. And more control, more autonomy in contraceptive use is one of these demands. So CMPTs are trying to respond to that need as well. But we'll come back to that a bit later. Yeah, that's all for this slide. We can move on to the next one. So this one is about funders and who they are. So since 2018, we looked at 30 different funders for contraceptive R&D. But it should be said that just under 90% of all funding for all years came from only 3 sources. So namely the US NIH, the Gates Foundation, and the industry that we approach as an aggregate here. Gates tend to support early stage R&D, while the US NIH has dominated funding for clinical development and post-registration studies, for example, with the Contraceptive Clinical Trials Networks that is coordinating clinical trials across the US for different methods. We tend to be able to capture the R&D stage of its products that we are capturing. With one of these actors, and namely industries, it might be a bit more difficult sometimes. There's missing information because some of the projects are undisclosed. So we have 40% of the total funding where we could not allocate an R&D stage, and that is mostly from the industry. That's it for this slide. We can move on. So yeah, in the next 3 slides, I'm going to do a bit of a deeper dive on different characteristics of the contraceptives that are showing trends that we thought were interesting. The first one is looking at gender and who are the targeted end users, so female or male, for the different methods. It's interesting because there's growing demand for more options that will allow for more share of the contraceptive responsibility, a more equal share. So what we see here in dark green, you have a contraceptive with a female end user in mind, and you can see it dominates the field quite a bit, but also that it's been gradually declining over the past years, and that a little bit more space has been made for methods for male end users. So that's sort of a positive note of like maybe funding taking into account that demand for more equitable options. And I'm going to use this slide to also underline another trend that we could see in male contraceptive R&D, which is that the majority of funding tends to go towards short-acting contraceptives for male contraceptives. But there's a recent increase in LARCs and multiple and unspecified duration, so from an average of 21% to 42% in 2021. So there's also a trend to keep an eye on. We can move on to the next slide. So the next thing that we wanted to look at was hormonal versus non-hormonal contraceptive methods. It is relevant because there's also growing demand for more non-hormonal options because of real and perceived side effects of hormonal products, because of, in some contexts, the importance of bleeding patterns and natural-looking bleeding patterns. And also in the specific context of LMICs, hormonal contraceptives tend to require medical supervision. And so that can be problematic in contexts where access to healthcare is inconsistent, for example. So having more non-hormonal options could help solve some of the accessibility problems faced by populations living in LMICs. So what we see here in dark green, you've got hormonal options, and you can see that it's still the majority of the products that are funded, but also that it's declining slowly, and that there's more and more space made for non-hormonal products. So again, a positive sign that maybe funding priorities are reflecting some of the user preferences that are emerging in the field. Yeah, that's the takeaway here. And we can move on to the next one. The last thing that we looked at was user control versus non-user control methods. So it's kind of the same as like the hormonal versus non-hormonal context, where there's both a growing demand for more autonomy in contraceptive use from users, and there's something specific to the LMIC context where where method controlled by the user might require less medical supervision, and so sort of solve or bypass some of the accessibility problems that can be happening in these countries. So here in light green, you have non-user controlled methods. And as you can see, it's still the majority in 2021, but it's been declining substantially. from 61% in 2018 to 35% in 2021. And also the user-controlled part has been increasing steadily from 21% in 2018 to 32% in 2021. So that's also a very encouraging trend, reflecting that maybe this demands for more autonomy for the users are being reflected into funding priorities. We can move to the next slide. So this is the last slide with data. We wanted to actually bring in CMPTs again. So this is the 4-year average for all of this different data breakdown that we did for the contraceptive R&D. And it's interesting to compare whether the trends that we witnessed in the contraceptive R&D space are the same in the CMPT space. On the left, you have the end user one, so taking into account the gender of the end user. And as you can see, interestingly enough, the trend in the contraceptive R&D field is not reflected in the CMPT's field, with most products actually targeting female end users. And that has to do with the fact who is funding this R&D. And a lot of the CMPT's projects are being funded by the industry and actually by women-centered, socially driven companies with the explicit goal of serving the needs of women and girls globally. With this dual protection need of both pregnancy and STIs and or HIV. And so this is because of the reason why these projects are funded, because of the identity of the funders, that the trend seems to be different when it comes to the gender structure of the R&D field. Then when we look at hormonal versus non-hormonal or user control versus non-user control methods, there you can see that the trends that we saw in the contraceptive field are confirmed somehow in the field of CMPTs, with actually 70% of products that are currently being funded being non-hormonal and up to 92% of products currently developed that are user controlled. And so that has to do again with the specificity of the field of CMPTs, where the design of the product is much more user-centric, and also with the sort of the way CMPTs are thought about is to solve many problems at once. So not just the protection against the risk of pregnancy and STIs and or HIV, but also solving problems that have to do with user preferences and accessibility, which is why there's more space for non-hormonal products and for user control products in that space as well. We can move on to the next slide, which is the conclusion, if I'm right. Yeah. So what the data shows is the general level of funding for this field that is rather stagnating and is actually slightly decreasing in the last years. Interesting comparison to be drawn to understand the order of magnitude of this funding is to compare it to compare the 2021 amount, so 170 million, to what was spent on LMIC relevant HIV R&D, which was almost $1.5 billion, and that's just for LMIC relevant HIV, not the general R&D. And another comparison that is also very interesting is to see that 243 million were spent by just one global company in 2021 for R&D for cosmetics and personal care, which sort of illustrates the priorities given to contraceptive R&D. But also, like I said, there are encouraging trends in the field towards more human-centered, user-centric design in contraceptive innovation, with more non-hormonal, user-controlled, male-focused products being funded. But it should also be said for these products that they tend to be in early development stages. So if we look at all contraceptives, 38% are in early stage research. But if we look specifically at this innovative contraceptives, it's much higher. So for example, 91% for non-hormonal methods, 58% for user-controlled methods, and 68% for male-only contraceptives. So it's products that we're not likely to see in the market very soon, but it's still showing an interesting trend in terms of funding reflecting user preferences that are emerging in the field, which is quite encouraging. And the last takeaway from this presentation is that this field is funded by a limited pool of investors. As we said, 90% of all funds come from 3 actors, the US NIH, Gates, so philanthropic funding, and the industry. There's no support from the public sector in LMICs. There's no support from public sector's multilaterals. So that makes the space quite vulnerable because of the limited pool of investors. So if any one of them was to pull out, pun actually not intended, if any one of them was to reduce their level of funding, that would actually change the landscape quite drastically. Yeah, that's it. And on the next slide, you have access to the data. So everything I've presented here is in our contraception R&D report published in last March. We also have a more general sexual and reproductive health report. The next one is going to be out in October 2023, so you can watch this space. And we also have a data portal with all of our data updated annually that you can have a look at. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cecile. This is really such an important analysis and so excellent that you all keep it updated. So thank you so much. For those who have questions for Cecile on her presentation, just a reminder to please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom. We're going to hear from our three speakers and then circle back to Q&A for all three of them. Also, just a reminder for those who may have joined late that we are translating this live in French and Spanish, and a reminder to our speakers to please speak a little bit slowly so that our translators who are translating live can have easy translation. So we're going to move now to our second presenter. Again, thanks to Cecile for that overview. Our next speaker is Stasia Obremski. She is the Managing Director of RH Capital, an impact venture capital fund of RIA Ventures, where she's responsible for investing in innovations in women's reproductive health. She founded the firm in 2018 after more than 25 years of experience as an interim CEO for nonprofit organizations and startup companies, and as an impact investor and philanthropist in women's reproductive health. So Stasia, thank you so much for joining us and for your amazing work in this field. Look forward to hearing about the work of RIA.
Thank you, and thank you for including me this morning. I think this is a great compliment to the data that Cecilia shared on the LMIC perspective and public sector funding. I'm going to move it to the other end of the spectrum and talk really from a capitalist perspective and a private investment perspective, and talk about what's happening with respect to private investment in contraceptive innovation. Next slide, please. So my agenda is very straightforward. I want to talk a little bit about what is venture capital and how does it impact this sector. I'll chat a little bit about RH Capital, the firm that I am one of the two managing directors of, and also what our contraceptive strategy and portfolio is. And then I'd like to share a little bit about how venture capital works from the inside. When we're evaluating an investment, whether it's in the contraceptive space or other space, what are the criteria or characteristics we are looking for in order to determine whether this is a financeable or a fundable opportunity? And this is, again, important insights for anyone on the call who is a developer, who is thinking about accessing the private market for funding for their innovation, whether it's in contraception or perhaps some other area of women's health or reproductive health. Next slide, please. So quickly, what is venture capital? So venture capital is private investment into early stage companies, and in return for that investment or funding, the venture capital firm gets equity or an ownership position in the firm in order to achieve long-term growth. So if you're an entrepreneur and you have an idea or an innovation, you have several questions ahead of you. First of all, how are you going to fund this innovation? How are you going to hire people, set up a lab, move your product into market? And you have a couple of funding options, and I've listed some of those on the left side. If you have means yourself, sometimes you can self-fund those. Sometimes you pass the hat to your family and friends and ask them to support your film or your entrepreneurial venture. In some cases, you can attract philanthropic funding who are interested in perhaps impact investing, or even sometimes make grants to companies that have a high social impact return. There are government programs in the US, there's SBIR or Small Business Association or Small Business Administration loans that companies can often qualify for. Sometimes you can get a straight out loan, which again is something you have to pay back, or you can go to the private market and you can attract venture capital. And I'm going to talk specifically about the venture capital option. And let's say you have an innovation, you approach venture capital funds, and venture capital funds have a typical 10-year fund life. And we get our capital from private investors who provide capital and investment capital and the venture capitalists manage that capital and make investments on behalf of those investors. And we commit to those investors, in the case of RH Capital, to make both a social return on that capital as well as a financial return on that capital. And we have to do that within a 10-year period. So if you're looking at an innovation that's going to take 20, 25 years to come to market or to actually have some economic value, it's probably not appropriate for venture capital. And venture capital ultimately achieves its financial return through what we call an exit. And an exit is either your company would get acquired or merged with another company, and the investors would get cash or stock in exchange for that, or the company will go public, file an initial public offering, will engage investment bankers, the last stage of this process, and the investment bankers will sell stock in your company to the public. Previously, the stock was held by private investors, but now there's going to be a public market for that stock. And one way that investors like venture capitalists achieve liquidity and achieve their financial return is through an initial public offering. So as an entrepreneur, you need to think about sort of the entire arc of your business and whether venture capital is the appropriate funding for that. Next slide, please. So venture capital plays a very important role in the US economy, increasingly in Europe, and more in Africa and other markets around the world. In the US, it's the #1 source of capital for the high growth economy. But a very small percentage of companies actually receive VC funding, less than 0.25%. And 50% of those companies, as I said, because the venture investors need an exit to achieve their financial return, go public, are VC backed. So a lot of the companies which file for initial public offerings are venture backed companies because those investors are looking for liquidity in order to achieve their financial return. And in the US market and Europe in 2022, the venture capital funding totaled $65 billion in healthcare. So it's a pretty big driver of capital and innovation in US and Europe. And we're seeing, again, venture capital funds dedicated to Asia and Africa coming, which are also starting to fund healthcare innovations in those markets as well. Some companies that I'm sure you've all heard of that are venture backed and have achieved initial public offerings and had significant financial returns to their investors are Facebook, Google, Uber, Netflix, Apple, and there are, again, many examples also in the healthcare space. So venture capital, while it makes up a small percentage of GDP, contributes a significant percentage in terms of output. So it's a very important tool in generating innovation in the US and European economies. Next slide, please. So what is RH Capital? So RH Capital is a venture fund. We are a impact first venture fund, which means we're looking for both social return and financial return. A lot of venture capital funds are just looking for financial return, but we have a dual mission, and we are focused in advancing innovations and health equity and reproductive health. We focus on contraception, both innovation and access, maternal health, as well as what we call other high impact areas of reproductive health, where there's significant unmet need, large markets, and where we are beginning to see some very interesting innovations. We're a relatively small fund in the venture ecosystem. We manage about $40 million, which means investors have given us $40 million to go out and find investments which both can meet social and financial returns. We have 18 companies in our portfolio to date. We'll probably have 20 by the time all of our capital is deployed. And we work with our strategic partner, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And our role is really to stimulate interest from other investors in the ecosystem. So to educate and bring along co-investors for contraceptive companies, as well as to support our contraceptive companies that are in our portfolio, help them build their boards, find partners, connect to other investors as they move their products through development. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk about what our strategy is, and it was interesting to hear Phil talk about the difference between the strategy of most of the funders and then the MPT funders, and we align much closely with the MPT funders in terms of what kinds of contraceptive innovations we're looking for. So our strategy is to focus on highly effective, non-hormonal. We're investing in both male and female methods. We're very interested in on-demand methods, and we're very interested in user control versus healthcare provider controlled methods. This helps us screen and prioritize what companies we will invest in and we'll evaluate as far as for investment. We've picked these criteria because we think this is where there's a gap in the market and where the research, the human-centered design and the customer research is telling us where customers want to see new products come. What we've seen in the US and in Europe is most of the innovation in the contraceptive space over the last 20 years has come in different types of hormones and different delivery methods from hormones, but not much work on really new mechanisms of action and non-hormonal mechanisms of action. So that is the sector that we're really trying to bring some funding to move some of those new, what we call next generation products forward. So currently we have a number of companies that we have invested in. One is called Contraline. These are all, actually not all US, some US and Europe based companies. It's a company working on a male contraceptive, a hydrogel that gets injected into the vas deferens and provides intermediate 18 to 22 month contraceptive effectiveness. Circle Biomedical, it's an on-demand vaginal gel, which cross-links cervical mucus and is currently in development. Ocon, which is a spherical IUD and potentially a drug delivery platform for a number of other APIs that need to be delivered locally into the uterus. Your Choice Therapeutics, which is working on both non-hormonal male and female contraceptive methods, and their male contraceptive asset will probably enter the clinic sometime in 2023. And then we have a number of companies in the portfolio that are focused on contraceptive access. Cadence is trying to bring the birth control pill over the counter in the US. It's a combined oral contraceptive, so both estrogen and progesterone in this formulation. As you may know, O-pill, the progesterone-only pill, was just in the last 2 weeks approved by the FDA for sale in the US. That's a very exciting development in this market. And 28 Health is a telehealth company that provides contraceptive, STI, and maternal health solutions via a telehealth digital distribution platform. So I think it's fair to say we probably have the largest contraceptive portfolio of any venture fund in the US. That's not a good thing. We really are trying to encourage other investment funds to look at this sector and to really recognize the unmet need and the financial opportunity here. Next slide, please. So just again, a little note about how the funding and capital work across the different stages. I think everyone is probably very familiar with the product development stages shown at the top: discovery, preclinical, early clinical, late clinical, and then commercialization. Every drug and device has to go through this process and some regulatory process in order to get to market. But if you're an entrepreneur, you also need to think about, you're very focused on the product development stage and moving your research forward. You also need to think about the different capital stages. And what we see, particularly with contraceptive innovation, is that the non-dilutive funding, what we call grants, government foundations, a lot of the funding that Cecilia was talking about, the policy research tracks, occurs in contraceptive, probably a lot more than other health indications. And that's because there's sort of a lack of alternative capital available. as your product moves further down the product development stage, though you are able to attack, because you've de-risked, right, the early part of your research, now you may be able to attract angels or small venture funds or family and friends to support your research. But ultimately, venture capital comes in and usually starts around preclinical, when you've got a proof of concept and some maybe early animal data, and will begin to be interested in your research. And again, we take early risks. So as you know, this is product development is a very risky process. And the sooner you are in the discovery end, the more risky it is, because the less data you have and less validation you have. We also see the pharma industry starting to pay attention now as products come out of the clinical trials, have been validated, and are perhaps ready for commercialization. Often you see the pharma and device industry begin to engage now. But what we see in contraception is that because there is a lack of this robust funding at the venture capital and the pharma space, the grant, the foundations, and the government funding is having to continue to fund through late stage and perhaps even into commercialization, particularly in LMIC markets. And again, our role in this ecosystem is to try to engage more investors to get them to appreciate the return potential in this field and to come in and provide additional funding to move products forward. Next slide, please. So when you think about what type of capital you need, depending on what stage you are in your product development process, if you're going to approach venture capital, again, you need to appreciate that each type of capital has a different risk return or impact return criteria that they're looking for. Private investment, which is again where our fund sits, is taking a high amount of risk, looking for a high amount of impact, but also expecting high financial returns. Public investment typically is really focused on social returns. They want to do the most benefit for the most people, and they're less focused on the financial returns. Corporate investment or strategic partners often sort of come someplace in between. They still need high return expectations, but they're less willing to take on risk. And so they're often not willing to invest until much later stage, when a lot of the de-risking has taken place by other sources of funding. So if you are going to look for private sector funding, a couple things are really important. And I want to talk a little bit more in detail about these. One, there needs to be a large or growing market, both in terms of revenue and in terms of demographic. The technology needs to be protected by a strong IP. We need to have a differentiation from competitors. There needs to be a clear regulatory pathway. Commercial and reimbursement potential needs to be there, and there needs to be a path to exit, either via IPO or acquisition. So you need to think about whether your product, your innovation can meet all of these criteria before you approach venture capitalists for funding. Next slide, please. All right, so does contraceptive innovations meet some of those criteria? Let's move through this quickly, but and again, I'll share this data with the participants a little bit later. Next slide, please. So let's start with just the demographics. So technically, this market should be an innovator's dream, meaning there are lots of potential consumers in the world for you to sell your products to. Our current estimate is that there are 450 million women across the globe who are potential users for new contraceptive technologies. They don't have all the same needs, but depending on your product profile, you can attract a large section of those. I want you to notice that in the US and Europe, the two markets are about, the target markets are about 27 million and 50 million in those two markets, so about 75 million total in US and Europe, and the rest of the world close to 400 million. So almost 10 times as many women in the rest of the world as in US or North America and Europe. This is, again, from a social impact standpoint, this is really important. You care about the number of people and the kinds of people that your innovation is going to attract. If you're a financial investor, next slide, please, you also care deeply about how that translates into revenue and profits. And so this looks at the global contraceptive market from 2025 through 2030. And you'll see that North America and Europe make up about half. The market in 2025 is about $28 billion. Half of that comes from North America and Europe, and about half from the rest of the world. And by 2030, that number is supposed to grow to about $35 billion. So the market's supposed to grow about 6% a year. So a nice steady growth rate. What you should notice, though, is that even though North America and Europe has substantially less consumers, the dollar value of that market is 10 times that of, or they have 10, the rest of the world has 10 times more people, but yet has the same dollar value. So that means the price or the value of the products sold in North America and Europe are significantly higher than those sold in the rest of the world. And that's why we as investors think that you have to have a dual market strategy, meaning that you have to be able to sell products in North America and Europe in order to, as well as the rest of the world, in order to achieve the financial return that you need. So that's a really important insight from this data. The next slide is also very data heavy, and I'll quickly just point out some insights from here. So these are the three markets: North America, Europe, and then the rest of the world. And you can see the relative size of each of these markets in 2025. But I think what's so interesting here is the product mix. So the US market is still predominantly hormonal-based. 82% of all revenues come from hormonal-based products. Europe, conversely, is driven by non-hormonal, as is the rest of the world, non-hormonal methods. And so we see, again, this shift in the US moving towards more interest in more non-hormonal methods. And we see on-demand methods, the lowest in the US, highest in Europe and the rest of the world. But we do see that changing to some extent over time. Next slide, please. So again, large market is important. Product differentiation from competitors is important. So I love this chart because it looks at the main pharma companies who sell these products across each of the categories. And when you do analysis like this, what you see is there are basically monopolies by category. So in the US, this is a US market perspective, there are 3 manufacturers of IUDs currently, 2 of patches, 1 generic, 1 branded, 3 of rings, again, 1 branded, 2 branded, 1 generic, and 2 injectables. So you basically have a category monopoly, with the exception of OC pills, where it's a very crowded market where many competitors. So if you're thinking about what is my category that I'm going to add to this, I'm looking at a new mechanism of action, you really have the opportunity, given the competitive landscape, to have, you know, a pretty important dominance of that category for some period of time before a product is able to be go through a generic process. So large market, able to be differentiated. Next slide, please. You know, regulatory guidance for product development is important in this phase. You know, we all know the regulatory process. What we do know is that in the US, the regulatory process is very focused on hormonal methods. So established regulatory standards in terms of size, number of cycles, pregnancy outcomes, Pearl Index that are trying to be measured. It's a little different between non-hormonal and male methods. I mean, those are 2 new regulatory pathways which not many companies have gone through. So some of our companies which are developing male methods are going to be the first ones to face the regulatory guidance requirements to sort of pave the way for hopefully other firms that or other companies that will work on those different mechanisms as well. Next slide. So again, reimbursement is very important in these markets. In the US, we have a very complicated multi-payer system. And even with the Affordable Care Act, which passed in 2010, which required that all insurance companies pay for contraceptive contraception and counseling with no out-of-pocket costs. That has not been necessarily enforced in the US, and we're still finding women having a hard time getting the methods that they want, particularly the more expensive methods. The payers tend to shepherd them towards cheaper generic products. There is a move towards enforcing the ACA, which again, we're very much in favor of. In Europe, there's a single payer system in most markets. So the EU recognizes reproductive health as a basic human right. A number of companies actually subsidize contraceptives with sometimes a small copay, but it's a slightly easier payer market to navigate if you're looking to bring a new product to market. Next slide. I think this is the last one. Again, we've had some good case studies of new products trying to come to market and understanding the barriers that they face. Phexxi was the latest product in the US, a non-hormonal gel to be launched. The hormonal patch also launched relatively recently, and then the hormonal ring. All of these products had particular challenges, mainly with reimbursement. So lots of lessons to be learned there. And we have seen, lastly, because I told you how important exits are, we have seen some R&D and some M&A activity. Organon recently signed a licensing development agreement with Circle Biomedical, one of the companies in our portfolio for the non-hormonal contraceptive. Teva sold their product Paragard to Cooper Surgical several years ago. So these are important sort of examples where there are exits, there are ways for investors to be financially, liquid. Next slide. I think this is my last slide. So just in closing, we do think that there is an interesting market opportunity for capital to flow for contraceptive innovation. We do have large markets. We have technology that can be protected by IPs. We think you can be differentiated among the competitors. The regulatory pathway is going to be a little bit of a challenge because particularly for new mechanisms of action, I would say reimbursement potential is there, but it needs to be enforced, and that we do see some exit potential. So next slide. So again, our pipeline, these are companies that we're tracking for potential investment from our fund. They're in various stages of their development process and affect different mechanisms of action. This is on the female side, non-hormonal female side. The left side is what we're tracking on the non-hormonal male side. Next slide, please. And again, happy to share this material. We are in constant conversations with these companies as they try to work their products through the product development process. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Stasia, for that wonderful presentation. Really informative, especially for those of us, I think, who work in the nonprofit sector or in government, or, this is really an interesting, important perspective to hear from your work on venture capital, and appreciate all the leadership you are in that space. So I know there are a lot of questions and comments for our two first speakers, but we're going to move forward with our third speaker, and then please be inserting your questions and comments in the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. And we'll get to as many as we can. And I know there have been some questions about sharing slides. This is being recorded and will be shared widely through multiple platforms. So we'll make sure you get the slides afterward. So now we're going to turn to our third speaker, Dr. Rebecca Callahan. For the past decade, Rebecca has served as a research scientist and more recently as Director of Research and Operations at FHI 360 within the Product Development and Introduction team, where she leads research related to user preferences for new contraceptives in development and oversees operational aspects of the team's work in contraceptive R&D. Prior to position at FHI 360, Dr. Callahan worked with the USAID Office of Population and Reproductive Health. She has a PhD in public health from the Johns Hopkins University and MPH from Emory. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here.
I was going
to say, I echo your comments about hearing from Stasia and this other side of the world, really, because my comments are really going to come from the NGO perspective, but I'll let you take the lead.
Great. So just for those, we didn't announce this at the beginning, but to make this more interactive and fun, we've structured this as a structured conversation. So we have some Q&A prepared for Rebecca and are going to ask her to share her thoughts and reflections through that mechanism. So she doesn't have slides, but I'll be sharing a few questions that were, again, pre-formed, and then we'll be opening it up to the audience for questions for any three of our speakers. So Rebecca, can you tell us how the team that you work with makes decisions about potential research for new products? And in particular, we've heard about some of the investment decisions that both private sector and the more NGO or donor supported investment decisions. So funders may have priorities, but I know that you're also deeply interested in the needs and desires of users, particularly in low and middle income countries. So can you talk about sort of how you balance those two things, funder priorities and understanding user needs and desires?
Yes, and I think I'll start by giving a really quick overview of FHI 360's portfolio, because I think that would help the audience, especially those who aren't as familiar with us. Many of you probably are. We've been around for a long time and engaged in contraceptive R&D for more than 50 years. Our portfolio currently, it really is heavily focused on longer acting and medium acting methods. Longer acting injectables, we have biodegradable implant leads, microneedle patch for contraception, smaller copper IUD. So those are the products that we're focused on. And I think this question about incorporating user perspectives is especially important when we're developing products like these, because they are so long acting, right? And they take the development timeline for these is inherently long, because we're looking for effectiveness for sometimes 3-5 years, right, for some of these products. So it is an interesting question, because once donors have made an investment in a longer acting product, which it's a large investment, has to be, you want to see that through to some extent, right? And so if we're and all of our work, we do incorporate user preferences research with all of our work, product specific work, and try our best to incorporate those responses and the reactions and perspectives that users are giving us into our work. But there is that I guess sometimes inherent tension when we have kind of already made the leap into looking at whether this biodegradable implant is going to last for 18 months. So if potential users come back and say, well, we're not so sure about that, it can be a challenge maybe to determine when you pull the plug on a product like that, right? So I think the other piece of this with the user perspectives and data is where, for the most part, asking people to react to hypothetical product concepts. So the best, to the extent we can, we will incorporate prototypes, if we have them in the research, so people can look at what the product may look like. You can handle it and see it, but you're still asking people to make a judgment call on something that doesn't yet exist and that they haven't had the chance to actually experience for themselves. So that element also has to be considered when we're trying to be, responsive to users' reactions, but also we want to let them have the opportunity to ultimately use the product. So that's an ongoing, I think, tension.
Thank you for that. We have quite a large group on the Zoom call today. Over 200 people have dialed in, which I really think shows the interest in R&D and potential products that are game changers in our field. And so but I think, again, for many of us who are on the call, we may not be as familiar with how the business development cycle for R&D works. And so can you just sort of walk us through it at a high level, sort of generally, how do contraceptive researchers, both in nonprofit or academic sectors, typically identify funding sources, build funding relationships, and develop proposals for R&D and product development specifically?
Yes, and I'd say again, my perspective is from an NGO, sector, which might be different than some of the developers, maybe startup companies that might be looking for venture funding or those kind of concepts that Stacia was talking about. Again, we've been in this field for many, many decades. There, as Cecilia was describing, there are only a handful of funders who have traditionally funded this kind of work. So, and we're a very small community. So we know each other, right? So we know, and our funding comes from USAID, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation predominantly. We have a few other smaller awards from other donors. The Children's Investment Fund Foundation is one, and but we have longstanding relationships with these donors, with the staff who work there, and so we rely on those relationships. And a lot of us, I think, in this field, which I think is kind of unique and something I like very much, is people stick around. I think we're committed, most of us, I think, really committed to this work. And so many of us have been in these careers for many, many years. And so we know each other. And I think that helps tremendously. We're able to have, frank conversations with each other, and really between the donors and those of us who are actually, doing the development work. And we're all on the same team, right? We're all trying to develop products that are going to meet users' needs and, reduce unintended pregnancy and ultimately have a positive impact on the world. So I think for newer people coming into the field, establishing those relationships comes through, actually, I think COVID has made it a little bit more challenging, right? Like we're not meeting in person as often. We used to meet frequently in meetings and things that would bring us together, different events. So now we have more events like this. So we're trying to, I guess, figure out new ways of connecting. I think this is a great example. I'm not sure I fully answered your question, but I think it's really just those, like anything, like personal relationships, forging those and maintaining them.
Thanks for that. I know something that you and I have discussed, and that I think the broader community is really grappling with, is how we also support principles and practices of diversity, equity, inclusion, including in the contraceptive R&D field. And as Stacia was really well illustrated, there are incentives for product developers to be focusing on markets in North America and in Europe. But of course, there's a huge unmet need for family planning in lower and middle income countries. So my question is, and again, hopefully we can open this up during the Q&A for additional thoughts. We have a lot of people here who are based in the global South, and sort of how do we expand the leadership so that the decisions about contraceptive R&D, both the decision making, but also the implementation of that research and product launch, is more driven within the global South?
I think it's a it's a very important question that we all on this call need to be thinking about. I think those of us, again, in the NGO world, in the development sector, are thinking about this, decolonizing global health more broadly. This fits squarely into it. We've had this model again for decades where, we're really coming up with the concepts, we're writing the protocols, we're leading the research, and then we go to our tried and trusted partners who are, for the most part, outside of the U.S. And in Latin America and elsewhere, who we've worked with for many years, who are wonderful. But it's still this really antiquated model of us coming up with the ideas and then them, leading the trials and then us writing the papers. We need to come up with a new paradigm, and it's really going to be, it has to involve us giving up that leadership role, like that we need to be the technical advisors, the consultants, the supporters, and it's going to be a really big job. I don't have an answer because it's so huge, right? It's just because it's going to require changing our whole system. I think we're beginning to think about ways of doing it. I mean, this is a small example, but we had a, I think, quite successful mentorship program for contraceptive R&D that we piloted last year, where several of us served as mentors and were paired with sort of budding researchers from around the world who are interested in, and potentially interested in contraceptive R&D. And I thought that was a really really positive experience all around. We need to now figure out how to grow that, how to make sure it reaches, you know, all different types of people who may be interested in this work. And it has to be more than that, right? We have to have more training opportunities, really building programs that are training new researchers outside of the US and Europe. And that, again, that's systems change. That's hugely, you know, we're not going to do it overnight by any means, right? It's going to be a years-long process, but it's going to have to be a concerted effort between the donors and us, you know, all saying this is what we want to do, and make it happen. So I look forward to other people's thoughts on this, because it is a huge question.
Yeah, and so please, if you want to weigh in on that question, please put a comment or question in the chat and we can call on you. Speaking of paradigm shifts, you know, let's think about the products more. And so I know you're quite interested in others. Stacia touched on this briefly, but, you know, thinking about products that are true game changers. And a lot of the methods that we use widely around the world were developed 30, 40 years ago. And so how do we sort of, what do you see as the way forward in terms of true innovation? And do you think, you know, do you think we're anywhere close to bumping up against the limits of what is possible in contraceptive R&D innovation? Thanks.
Well, the last part's the easiest. We're nowhere close to bumping up to the limits. I mean, we're barely scratching the surface, I think. I mean, what we're working on at FHI 360, I mean, are great products, but they are repackaging the contraceptive steroids that we've been using for 40 years. There's nothing, so they're new delivery systems, and they may be easier. I mean, of course, they may be more user-friendly, they may be more appealing, but they're not going to address the main causes of method dissatisfaction, which we know are related to side effects, you know, specifically menstrual side effects and other side effects. And these progestins that we're using are going to have those same effects. There's no way around it. So I was very excited to hear about the RIA Ventures portfolio and all the non-hormonal products and other, you know, other mechanisms of action. But I think there's so much more, and it's going to require a much larger investment way upstream in the discovery phase to elucidate those potential targets and those new mechanisms of action. We are nowhere close, and that's the part that it's encouraging, but it's also discouraging, because we know that it's going to take a lot more funding. I mean, many times more funding than what we've been talking about here today to really get to those game changers. So, and I do know that, you know, the NIH has, of course, historically funded that early phase discovery research and continues to do so. And I know the Gates Foundation is very committed to growing that part of their portfolio as well, which is very encouraging. But it's going to require a hefty investment.
For that. We just have a couple more minutes, so let me just ask you about the pathway to introduction and scale up, and something that I know the CTI Exchange, which sponsored the mentorship program that you mentioned just a minute ago, has talked a lot about, is beginning with the end in mind. And I also want to, you know, that comes in a lot of different angles: pricing, regulatory. Stacia talked about some of the regulatory pathways within North America and in the US, but I also want to give a shout out to the World Health Organization's pre-qualification program, which can help expand approvals for low and middle income countries. So Can you just say a little bit about how we can begin with the end in mind as we think about contraceptive R&D and what you see as the priorities are to ensure that we don't create silos between R&D activities over here and introduction and scale up activities over here?
Yeah, it's really challenging, right? Especially when you're really early on, when you're just trying to see if a concept's going to fly. Is this even going to work, right? At that stage, yes, we have to be thinking about the costs of goods, you know, the COGS, what are the components of this product and what are they going to ultimately cost? That's something we think about all the time. You know, it's like forefront in our decision making around products. And with another element of this is with our user preferences work, which, as I mentioned, we have associated preference work with all of our technologies. Part of that work is looking at health systems, thinking about how these new products would eventually be integrated into the various health systems. How well would they be able to be integrated? We talk to providers because, of course, their opinions on new products are going to be, if as important, if not more important than the users. What do they think about them? So all of that we incorporate into our thinking as well. You know, Stacia made the point, which is very important. Like, FHI 360 is not going to market these products that we are working on, right? And the Gates Foundation and USAID is not going to market these new products. We have to find commercialization partners to take these products ultimately to the market and to users. So that's the piece in my mind that is the trickiest, and the part that we, you know, I'm not sure we even have a good example of it yet, at least in our portfolio and our work. It is tricky. And I think it's going to require a lot more of us putting our heads together around that. How do we ultimately get these products to market? How do we scale them up and introduce them? So, I mean, we have some great, you know, the hormonal IUD work has gone very well, but it's still very, very nascent, very small scale, you know. And that's an example of what we can do. The Gates Foundation and USAID have funded that, and it's great. But again, without like really full scale commercial market power, like it's gonna be challenging.
Well, thanks for these reflections. We need to wrap up, so I'm going to hand it to our colleague Audrey to facilitate the Q&A. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I really appreciate your honesty and transparency about the challenges and as well as the opportunities. And Audrey, can I hand it to you to go through our Q&A that we've received?
Absolutely. We've had quite a few questions. And hello, everybody. My name is Audrey Freitas. I'm a technical officer at FHI 360. Myself and my colleague, Emily, have been running some of the webinar functions behind the scenes. Thank you all so much for your thoughtful questions in the Q&A. We've gotten quite a few. I want to kick us off with a question for Cecile and the Policy Cures team from Pepe Lama and Monica Kerrigan. This is a somewhat simple question with what I suspect is a very complex answer. So we've heard today, and I believe our speakers and our attendees know, there's considerable global demand for contraceptive products. So given that demand, do you have a sense for why investment in contraceptive R&D is comparatively low when measured against other health areas, and why the number of funders working in this space is so constrained? And then building off of that, if you have any thoughts, is there any sense of what organizations can do to sharpen their advocacy to funders to make a case for increased funding?
Yeah, I mean, I can try to provide some parts of the answers, but that's not PCR's expertise, because we look at funding and not, like, this is political decisions, basically. The reasons why it's never been a high priority are also super political. We have to take that into account as elements of analysis for us, for example, to understand specific aspects of the fields, but then why would it not be a priority? It has things to do with gender policies, with equality policies, with autonomy of users and autonomy over their own bodies. And they are kind of eternal questions, I would say. I don't know if Andrew, my other colleague from Policy Cures Research, has more to say to that topic, but I would say it's not really Policy Cures Research expertise. And that is a question that is always relevant for all advocacy groups across the world to try and make it part of a human rights approach, like sovereignty over our own bodies being a human right, about being a health right. And there's still progress to be made in that area, I would say.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrew Tuttle at Policy Cures Research as well. Sorry, I tried to turn my camera on, but I'm not able to, but that's all right. I'll just add a couple of thoughts to Cecile's points, which are to say that when we're looking at the landscape of sexual and reproductive health, R&D, and the investment that goes into it, we have to not only acknowledge the market failure, the kind of multiple dimensions of the market failure that's being asked about here, and that a lot of that is very much driven by the kind of reputational risks that industry are not prepared to take on, or the risks of litigation, frankly, given the populations in question that this essential research needs to be done in. And in order to overcome those barriers that are preventing more comprehensive or research into women's health issues, I think we're going to continue to see these gender-driven market failures, just given the fact that a lot of big pharma are not prepared to work on issues where the starting point is essentially healthy women, who may then become at risk of falling unhealthy in a clinical trial, or falling pregnant. And these are really major policy barriers that need to be overcome in order to change fundamentally the shape of the market, I think.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. And I think it's important to note that contraceptive products are distinct from other kinds of pharmaceutical development in some ways, which is why you might not see necessarily the direct demand leading to greater investment that you might see for other things. This is a unique field with unique investment considerations. Absolutely.
I just wanted to add one or 2 points. So I think Andrew mentioned a couple key things. You know, pharmaceutical companies do not like making products for healthy populations. They're in the business to make drugs for people who are sick and suffering, which is great. You know, sometimes we say contraceptives, have additional regulatory risks because very high safety standards, and then legal risk. You know, a lot of product liability issues. I think the other thing it suffers from is that we have good enough solutions, like hormones are good enough. We've solved this problem, we need to move on. Well, you ask any woman who has been being asked to take systemic hormones over 30, 35 years, they'll tell you that's not good enough. But again, from a policy standpoint, there isn't the sort of the will, or, the other thing we hear is that contraceptive products fall into a lifestyle category. And again, payers don't like to pay for lifestyle drugs. They only like to pay for medically necessary drugs. But again, it's the perspective of who's the decision maker. I think there's a lot of gender issues here. Who are the decision makers who are deciding that this is a lifestyle, not an important medical need, and that what we have is not good enough, and that we really want to see innovation. I do think there's a real role for advocacy. You know, I always say we need an ACT UP for contraception. You know, we need a group of very vocal women and women's voices coming through as very loud and very angry in some cases, voices demanding more funding for, a fundamental reproductive product that we need for a large number of years in our life.
Thank you so much, Stacia, and thank you, Andrew and Cecile. On the same vein of what we have is not good enough, for Rebecca, I know that this is an area of interest for your team at FHI 360. We got a question from Saswati Das. What do you believe is the scope and opportunity for research and development and innovation for pericoital on-demand contraceptives? This is an emerging area, and the asker notes that this kind of contraceptive could potentially address unmet needs for youth, unmarried women, clients who have discontinued use of regular contraceptives. What do you see as being sort of the next horizon for pericoital methods?
Well, that's a very timely question for us, actually, because right now we are exploring the potential of to actually do a clinical trial to look at the effectiveness of a pericoital repurposing a emergency contraception levonorgestrel product. So right now we're just at the very earliest phases in discussions with the Gates Foundation, other donors around whether this should be a priority, whether we should take the leap and invest the many millions that it will require to do a phase 3 trial of this. But the reason why we're having these conversations is exactly what the person asked. It's that people are already using these products in this way, and there's a great interest in not having to take a pill every day or use something continuously when you're not having sex maybe as frequently. So people are already doing, it's an interest, so we need to explore it. So it's TBD whether we're going to take it to the next stage, but it is something that we're exploring.
Along that same vein, and I'd open this up to the floor, there's Helen and Yasi notes in the Q&A, there's proven demand for MPTs, but there's nothing yet in the market. Does this group have any thoughts about how products that would provide both protection from unwanted pregnancy and protection from HIV or other STIs, what might accelerate those into the commercial market given the high demand? And we did get quite a number of questions about MPTs. While our speakers think about it, I do want to direct this group to the Initiative for Multipurpose Prevention Technologies, who have a wealth of resources available about products that provide dual protection. If not, we'll provide an answer in writing in the future. So just in the interest of keeping us on time, I do want to pose some questions to Stacia. Stacia, there's been quite a lot of interest in the Q&A box about the venture capital model, private investment in contraceptive technology. I think this is a really interesting and new concept for a lot of our attendees. So there's two questions that pair together, one from Megan Christofield and one from John Townsend. First, how can we, meaning the global contraceptive research and programs community, encourage more venture capital focus on contraceptive and or reproductive health? Sort of what are some ways to steer interest in this area, given the risks we've already talked about during the Q&A? And then second and related, what would you say is the probability of high return on investment in the contraceptive space, given the long timeline for research and development, introduction, full scale up? So I'll leave it at those two for now.
Yeah, good question. So what can the global community do to try to encourage more venture private investment? I say to everybody, we need proof points. We need demonstration of unmet need, consumer demand. The market research study, which was just completed by the Gates Foundation on male, the global study that was done on male interest in male contraception, is an example of incredibly, again, robust, thorough research to demonstrate that if we make it, we will have customers. And I know both of my portfolio companies who are developing male methods are integrating that data, particularly for the US market, into their pitches, which is, when they go out to raise money, they put together a pitch deck. And you can guarantee that that data is there. So I think those kinds of market research, human-centered design, which illustrates some of these market trends where we think there are market gaps, is very important. I think advocacy is very important. I think, again, for the venture market, we have to demonstrate the need for financial returns and or the possibility of financial returns. So, I think what we need more than anything is a successful proof point. So we need one of our portfolio companies to get far enough into clinical trial, enough for it to be clinically validated, that a Organon or a Merck or a Bayer comes in and is willing to pay a premium price for that asset, because the venture world took the early risk, de-risked it to a certain point, and that they see the value of that, and they're willing to finish the clinical trial and then to commercialize the product. So they really are going to have to see the financial return. And yeah, it does take, a long time potentially to get to market, but I do think I do think contraceptive, the companies that have these contraceptive portfolios, they know they're sitting duck. They know that the minute that there is a new mechanism of action, a better mousetrap out there, that their hormonal portfolios are going to be completely cannibalized. So they're watching. I mean, literally, Bayer has spoken to every company that we've invested in. They are scanning the market. They're not completely ignoring this fact. They just want somebody else to take the early risk to validate the technology. But they're watching, and again, we need one or two of these assets to be acquired and to show that there's financial potential there to really drive more capital into the field.
And I think that links back to an earlier comment that Rebecca made, that what we're talking about today is really only one piece of this entire concept, that the commercialization partner is a fundamental part of this whole conversation. And I do want to do a little promo. Our next event in this series is on access strategies, how a product gets from the very final stages of development and ultimately into the hands of users. If you're interested in that topic, we'll let you know how you can get alerted about that later. So we have time for one final question. And this is combining questions from Mark Hathaway and Lucy Wilson. Starting with Stacia, how do you see investment in the North American and European markets ultimately leading to greater access to new contraceptive technologies elsewhere in the world? Could you walk us through sort of how that process might work?
Yeah, a good question. We've had a lot of conversations about this internally at RH Capital, because again, with our partnership with the Gates Foundation, we've actually run a couple of webinars for our portfolio companies, basically on market access in an LMIC market. So, usually we see a sequential, like first this market, then that market, then eventually we get to the rest of the world market. And what we really want to see is simultaneous market development. And for product developers to think today, when they're still in their CPP or their clinical protocol development, to have a sense of what are the regulatory requirements in some of these rest of world markets. And if I do this now, that means I have, I'm going to have an accelerated regulatory process here. And so we, again, with Gates funding, sponsored 2 webinars with Propellate and Global Catalysts Global to really explain how the LMIC markets differ from the European and US markets with respect to 2 things, mainly regulatory and access. So there's a big public sector in those markets. How do those purchasing mechanisms work? What does the private sector look like there? And again, making even these startup companies with 2 to 20 people to even start planting those seeds, I think is really important, because a lot of them are mission oriented and would really love to see a global product, both for social reasons and for financial reasons. But just giving them a little bit of insight today, even if they're early in their development process, I think is something that we think is very important, and we think we need to continue to talk about. In fact, I'm going to direct them to your access webinar coming up, because again, this is a great learning opportunity for them, even if they're early in their development process.
Thank you so much, Stacia. We are at time for questions, so I'm just going to leave a last thought in people's minds, and if we get the opportunity, we may answer this in writing and disseminate it. there's an excellent question from David in the Q&A, noting that if traditional approaches, capitalist approaches, have failed to act on obvious opportunities, so the opportunity being huge demand, but little investment, why are we still using the same framework to seek answers moving forward? So thinking about examples of where product development, product launch, and dissemination went totally right, or something that would allow us to meet that goal in the near future. So it's a big question. We don't have time to dig into it today, but I do think it's a really important thing for all of us on the session today to keep at the back of our minds. So I'm going to hand it back over to Kate to do our last introduction.
Thanks so much, Audrey. And we are really fortunate and blessed to have Dr. Samu Dubey on the phone, who's the director of the FP 2030 initiative. And Dr. Samu, for those of you who don't know, has over 20 years of experience in healthcare delivery and financing, a physician by training. Her career began in maternal and child health, and she has extensive background in global NGOs, philanthropy, and entrepreneurship, which guides her leadership of FP 2030. So Dr. Samu, we're so grateful to have you here. And that last question we received about sort of how do we not repeat the mistakes of the past and truly have innovative approaches might be a good place to hand the baton to you for your closing remarks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Kate, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone who cared to join us here online. It's been a great 1.5 hours trying to deliberate on what is it that women want, and are we actually meeting what women want? Obviously, this field is tainted with many opportunities and hopes, but equally so, I think, missed opportunities, which I'm hoping that everyone in the room today will really care to work hard and fulfill. I think, as we're talking about, the R&D and the funding for R&D for women's health in general, but in particular today, we're talking about contraceptive technologies. We need to care more. We need to care more about what women want. We need to care more about what women are saying, and we need to listen more. And it's a challenge because we are looking at what payers want, and we often develop our pipelines around who is going to pay, etc., because that's the right thing to do if you're in venture capital, if you're in capital markets, etc. But we know that this is the challenge before us is not going to be solved by one entity. So we are pleased as FP 2030 to host this round of webinar jointly with the Contraceptive Technology Innovation Exchange, CTI. Just glad for some of the classes that you are holding and hosting in partnership with Population Council, RHSC, and FHI 360. Thank you so much, everyone who actually spoke. Rebecca, we really appreciate, following, the pipeline at FHI 360 and from Policy Cues, what we are hearing. This webinar was planned as the second part of the webinar series on contraceptive technology and innovation and how it can align with what women want. It's interesting, I recently came from a trip in Uganda where I heard that many women are using a pill, which they call a Chinese pill. This is once a month pill. It's oral, obviously, because it's a pill, and it's got high estrogen content. Why do women use this? Because they do want something that they can self-administer, something that is easy to administer, like once a month. Even though it contains such a high estrogen content, they are still pursuing it, and it's not available legally. So it's not an FDA-approved technology, but somehow women are accessing it. I think for me, it's high time we ask, when we're saying human-centered design, what is it that women want, despite the fact that we hear there are some deaths that have been reported from use of this pill? What is it that we are not meeting? Is there suppressed demand? Is there demand that our current technologies are not meeting? And I think this conversation is important because we want to fulfill that need. So we zoomed in today on funding models and strategies that would facilitate contraceptive research and development. We had two esteemed speakers, and thank you so much for both of you for presenting challenging trends that we are seeing in the funding landscape, and maybe even the encouraging progress that we are seeing towards supporting this human-centered design that I'm talking about. as well as innovative approaches to strengthening the contraceptive technology market through strategic investment. We heard from Cecile, Global Funding for Contraceptive R&D, where she spoke about how we could broaden horizons to meet a diversity of needs. And I do hope that, Cecile, as we are talking about who is funding what and where, the voices that are coming from the field would help hopefully bolster some of that funding so that we can see not only diversity of funding, but even the quantum increasing. I was so glad, Cecile, to even see some of the funding that is coming from markets like in Brazil actually coming into the mix, because we've got traditional funders, but we need a better mix of funding these technologies if we are to move forward in a synchronized way. We heard again from Stacia about the private investments in contraceptive innovation, again starting from venture capital, and in your partnership with the Gates Foundation. Thank you so much for your leadership and taking this to what capital markets could do in increasing diversity of investment for contraceptive R&D. We also heard from Rebecca, who led a rich conversation. I really liked it with the panelists on impact of funder strategy on research capability. And Rebecca, you were talking about like one of the questions that spoke about how do we even diversify the mix of who is doing research. And so thank you for the mentorship program that you spoke about. And again, Cecile, there was one you spoke about, a masterclass, because that will also bolster capacity around research, but also even interest on research, as we all know. Family planning for FP 2030, and I'm sure for most of the partners who are in this room, colleagues, is the smartest investment to unlock opportunity for millions of women and their families in low and middle income countries. When we care better, we will see that this field, not only is it profitable in the short run, but in the long run, it actually does more for women's economic empowerment. I heard numbers, and Monica, you asked a question about 1 billion, more than 1 billion women of reproductive age. And you did quantify, one of the speakers quantified 450 million women who would actually need these new contraceptive technologies. I think this is a market that is worth pursuing. We believe that this is underfunded, as you saw from the presentation, and is understudied, and investing in women's health, I believe, is often replaced with other priorities. There are some pieces of work that as FP 2030 and partners who are in this room, we are pursuing to ensure that women's health in general can be funded better. And we've observed that this, during the COVID-19 pandemic, this actually escalated and the funding sort of took a nosedive. Cecile, you pointed out in your presentation, if I recall, that global investment in contraceptive R&D has also been stagnant for a long time and even declined in recent years. That is something that we ought to watch out for. Contraceptive technology, colleagues, hasn't seen even much innovation, and I was intrigued to see why we need to be investing more and more in non-hormonal methods, because that's what countries are saying, that's what women are saying, that's what even nations are actually saying. We need more and more of this. But again, as we conclude this webinar, the good news is that we do have strong partners who are committed to the investment for contraceptive R&D, such as the Gates Foundation and the US NIH. The global contraceptive market will be continuously growing. We are seeing the numbers every day. We do need more investors and funders from diverse sectors, again, from venture capital, from even domestic resources. I would love to see more African governments, Asian governments, contributing more to R&D for contraceptive technologies. We do need this more than ever before. Private investors, you heard the call that the market is open for this to ensure that R&D efforts are catalytic and they are also sustainable. And I also believe, colleagues, as we conclude for this, we also see positive trends in contraceptive R&D, which is more human-centered. From the work that White Ribbon Alliance and partners have been doing around what women want, we do need to follow through this trend to advance gender equality in research and development, so the method mix for women and men can be expanded to appeal to more diverse population and potential users. We are committed as an organization to enhance a platform that would continue to dialogue on contraceptive technology research and development, and to leverage the collective initiatives and investments from diverse sectors so that we continually address the evolving needs for women and girls, and also the marginalized populations to ensure that these methods are aligned with what users want. So thank you very much, and over to you, Kate, if you want to make any concluding remarks.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much. You're leaving us with a sense of call to action and urgency and passion. And thank you so much. Thank you again for all of our speakers and participants. We'll end it here, but again, please stay engaged, participate in the next webinar series, share your insights on social media. And again, thanks to all who contributed, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.